Welcome back to the Glosso podcast, and today we are talking all things Premier League. Hot on the heels of the Superliga restart a couple of weeks ago, European football is now back underway, and after the opening weekend of fixtures in England's top flight, we take a look at all things Argentine. Poch, Lo Celso, or should that be Lo Celso, Agüero, Lanzini, El Loco, and maybe more coming up. Please be sure to like, share, follow, subscribe, and all that malarkey, however you are listening. As ever, I'm joined by co-host Tom Robinson. How's it going?
Yeah, all good. Really enjoying the restart of the Premier League and having my team back in it after a few years out. A bit of a rude awakening to procedures, but yeah, it's good to be watching them in it again, and looking forward to discussing the Argentinian involvement. Yeah,
we'll get swiftly on to your boys in a moment, but we're honoured to have him back for a third time on the Glasso podcast already, and we're joined by Mr. Tim Vickery. How's it going, sir?
Yeah, very well. Preparing to make another trip down to Buenos Aires. Slightly alarmed by looking at what the temperature is going to be like next week. We're over 30 degrees in Rio at the moment, although we're about to be hit by a cold front and a tropical storm. But it's still much, much more pleasant than what's in store for me in Buenos Aires next week. How do you cope with winters in Buenos Aires, Peter Coates?
Well, I mean, once you've come from England, it's not too bad. But certainly from what you're used to, it's rather nippy at the moment. And,
what on earth are they doing putting the sun on the flag? It's just a giant con, I think.
Well, I mean, when you're coming from Rio, perhaps, but I think you've just been away too long, Tim. You need to come perhaps. When you're coming in from London, then it's beautiful.
I've been spoiled. You're right.
Yeah. Well, there's only really one place to begin, as you alluded to there, Tom. The subject, when you're thinking about Argentinian players in England at the moment, is in North London. Tim, your beloved Tottenham began the season with a 3-1 win over Tom's Aston Villa. So this is perhaps a happier subject for you. What did you make of Tottenham's start to the season, and sort of looking at this from an Argentinian perspective for Pochettino? Could this be the year that he gets his hands on some silverware?
Oh, of course it won't. It's what you sign up for when you're a Tottenham fan. You sign up for heroic defeats. And I still look at them and think, can they compete for the series silverware with the likes of Man City and Liverpool, and still can't quite see it. Just hope that the momentum keeps going, which is difficult after last season. It's difficult after you've come second in the Champions League. How do you have forward momentum from that without necessarily winning a trophy? But the first full season in the new stadium, hopefully I'll be back in a couple of months. And I might just catch in a game to have a look at the new stadium, because that's clearly going to be a point in favour of Tottenham and Pochettino. But you wonder if this is kind of make or break season for the coach at the club. You wonder if at the end of this season he might well consider that he's taken the thing as far as it can go.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the lack of a trophy does play on his mind? Does it factor into his reputation at all?
Well, I'm sure it does. Yeah, I'm sure that he would love to end that drought this season. It's been nagging away at it for a while now, and there's always been a justification for maybe no. The big one last year was the stadium. Well, now everything's in place, so the expectations are cranked up. But as I say, you look at Liverpool and Man City and you think, can Tottenham compete with that over the course of not just compete with it, but beat it over the course of a complete season? And I'm still inclined to have my doubts, though I'd love to be proved wrong.
Of course you would. And if it was to be his last season, of course, no doubt we would get the age-old questions of, could Pochettino head to Argentina as the national team boss? I mean, what are your views there, Tom?
No chance at all. I mean, he's at the prime of his career. He's definitely not going to be looking to take on the national team job just yet. That job is assured for him at some point in the future when he wants it. I think he's realistically going to be looking at going to one of the real super clubs in world football, depending on what landing spaces there are available for him. Obviously, if things don't go too well at Madrid, then he would definitely be one of the front runners there. Same goes for United, although I don't think they're particularly a step up at this point in the current context of the Premier League. But again, there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of potential there to get them back on track. So, I mean, I think it's going to be more a case of what happens at Spurs. Can he get himself a trophy? Would a trophy sort of almost be a nice sort of way to round off his time there? As he kind of hinted before the Champions League, he was making a few sounds of, well, even if I win it, maybe I won't go on. A lot of people would have thought this could be the start of a really nice project with the new stadium and some extra money and players coming in, as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss. But I mean, I would personally like to see him stay at Spurs. But as Tim's rightly said, there's only so long you could probably hang on to him before he might seek a new challenge.
Yeah, but they can probably rest easy, is what you're saying, that it won't be Argentina that comes along and snaps him up.
No, I don't think they ever have enough pesos in their pocket to get anywhere near, maybe just a suit for him, let alone getting him actually in as a full-time job. So I don't think that's going to come around. Same with Simeone, as we've discussed for a while. I think they're both the dream scenarios, but if they are to move on from Escaloni, then it's more likely to be one of those maybe local-based managers like Gallardo, as we've discussed before in the pod.
Yeah, absolutely right. Of course, Tim, you did mention the lovely new stadium. Pochettino, during this pre-season, at one point seemed a little bit narked at the lack of activity or how slow transfers came, but we did eventually see Giovani Lo Celso make the move to Spurs. We had a question come in from Daniel Alvarez, who asked a question. Well, the first question seemed to be, how do you pronounce his name? In which he seemed to make a video for Spurs saying Lo Celso, which seemed to go against what a lot of people in Argentina have been calling him, even with him present. But that's by the by. It seems as though it's one of those things in Argentina that no one really seems to mind how they pronounce their names. But moving on, where do you think his best position is? Daniel Alvarez asked, is he best in the number 10 role or a little deeper as a number 8? He seems very versatile, and just curious how you think Pochettino might play him.
Well, first of all, I think the way that this deal appears to have been carried out sums up some of Tottenham's priorities and perhaps highlights the frustration that Pochettino feels with the club from time to time. Because, there's a reason that this happened right at the end of the Premier League transfer window, and that is that Daniel Levy was playing poker. Betis had taken him on loan and then bought him with the hope of cashing in, and Daniel Levy doesn't want to play that game for him, so it's a loan with an option to buy. So for the moment, Betis don't have the player and they don't have the money, or they don't have anything like the amount of money that they will have when they sell him. That's the reason that you wait until the last moment to see if another bid will come in. No, that's the best we can do. Okay, off he goes to Tottenham. So it shows you a certain cautious mentality in the way that negotiations are done at Tottenham. And Pochettino was clearly expressing his frustration at that kind of situation. What have Tottenham got? I think that they've bought a terrific player, and I've been a fan of him all the way up from the run to the final of the Argentine Cup in 15. And most of his time in Argentina, he was a kind of 10. But he's had to add more strings to his bow. I mean, Paris Saint-Germain bought him, tried to shoehorn him into the team somehow, ended up playing him much deeper. Now, that's one thing in the French domestic league. It's another thing when you're suddenly pitched in to a Champions League match away to Real Madrid. And he really didn't do well in that game at all. However, I think that's all part of his education. And that, that's a step that he takes on the way to being a more complete, perhaps European-style midfielder. So I think Tottenham have acquired someone and he carries the ball so well. He's got that wonderful left foot. He's got the eye for a pass. And Christian Eriksen, as Tom alluded, was the name of the game on Saturday when he came on and changed the game. But I think in time, and this is especially true if Eriksen goes in the last few weeks of the European transfer window, I think that there is the possibility of a replacement there. And in terms of his dynamism, I think it could even be an upgrade. I wonder about Eriksen. He's a lovely player. I love watching him. But I wonder if he is a player, and I know that many Tottenham fans have the same view. If he is a player who is capable of moving higher than Tottenham, can you really see him tipping the balance week in, week out for one of the real giants? I'm not too sure about that. I'm not too sure that he's sufficiently dynamic to do that. So my hope would be there is a complementary player for Eriksen, but also a possible replacement for Eriksen, who could, in the long term, prove to be an upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, I think the three of us would have seen him when he came through at Central, would have been hugely impressed at a young age. And I think you're right that he does seem to have added that versatility to his game. From an Argentinian national team perspective, Tom, I think at times we saw him, that versatility perhaps being a bit of a problem for him personally, because he seemed to be asked by Scaloni to try and do a lot of different roles. Where do you see him fitting in for the national team going forward?
Yeah, it is very interesting, because I think that dynamism is both a massive string to his bow, but also something that can lead to him being tried out in numerous positions, especially while in the Argentinian national team context, it's still working out what is the best formation. We've seen him being used more as a kind of double pivot, as the more creative, deep-lying midfielder along someone like Paredes. We've seen him more in his more customary number 10 role that we used to see him at Central and certainly at Betis last season. But then, the Copa America, he was kind of shunted out to the left a little bit at times, and he didn't quite have the same impact. So I think...
wide right, didn't he? When he started off wide right, he played the warm-up game wide right, started off wide right. And this, for me, Tom, this is part of the perhaps the ideological confusion that Scaloni's Argentina are in, Does he want quick transitions to the wings or not? Because you can't see. I mean, I thought they were dreadful against Colombia, and in the first game they got better afterwards. Maybe because Scaloni rethought. But can they go long term with Messi plus two strikers? It's killing the strikers. We'll get to Agüero later on. You wonder how much he took out of himself in that Copa America. So I think the question has so much to do with what the shape of the side is. Where you can fit him in. He's clearly not a 10 for Argentina, because there's a certain Lionel Messi who has that role, although not for the friendlies over the next couple of months. So he ended up kind of almost competing with Acuna for left side role, either tucked in closer to Paredes or wider on the flank. I prefer him in a more central role.
Definitely, yeah. I think that'll be interesting to see as well, if Spurs do kind of go for this diamond that they've been playing, if they can perhaps have Winks at the base and then Ndombele alongside Lo Celso, with then Eriksen or Dele or even Lamela as the kind of tip of the diamond. I think that is somewhere where he could work. But as you said, he is a potential replacement, if not a like-for-like replacement. He is someone who provides similar qualities, but also maybe more of a quality that fits how Pochettino wants to play the game. Someone who, he does get stuck in a fair amount. He wins lots of fouls. He takes on a lot of players. His dribbling, as you mentioned, is certainly probably better than Eriksen's in that respect. In terms of goals from midfield as well, if you look at the numbers from La Liga compared to Eriksen in the Premier League, they're pretty much level. I think 9 for Lo Celso, sorry, and 8 for Eriksen. But I think the area that Eriksen probably does have that different class is maybe his vision right now and ability to unlock a defence might just be that one notch above Lo Celso, even though that's no criticism on Lo Celso. I think he's got that in his locker, and it'll be interesting to see how he's played and potentially how he can maybe help Dele Alli sort of regain some of that amazing form that we've seen from him in the past. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think there's a lot of reason for Spurs fans to get excited, and I think he's got to be a crucial midfielder going forward for the national team as well, because he's got a bit of everything, and I'd like to see him settle down. He's been chopping and changing the clubs sort of fairly regularly. It'd be lovely to see him stay for 3 years or so at Spurs and really kind of cement himself as a top level midfielder for club and country.
What's your take on the name thing, Pete? Because he was always Lo Celso in Argentina, and his brother played for the under-20s at the start of this year, and he was Lo Celso as well. So what on earth is going on? Please explain.
No, I'm the same as you. I mean, I know we had this conversation a couple of weeks back, but when he made that video and all these people were saying, see, I told you it was Lo Celso, I was made to look like a fool, because I'm the same as you. I'm led to believe, and as I said, I've seen him on TV here, like back when he was at Central and when he's come back for national duty, where being interviewed, they've referred to him as Lo Celso, and there's been no hint of him suggesting, hang on a second, you're pronouncing my name wrong. So seems to be one of those odd Argentinian quirks where those sort of Italian style names, no one really seems quite sure how to pronounce it, and no one really seems to care either.
I wonder if this is something that's happened to him in Spain, where they don't use the Italian C. Unlike Argentina, Argentina are Italians who speak Spanish, and in Spain they're Spaniards who speak Spanish. So I wonder if he's taken on a in the same way that you in Buenos Aires become Peter Coates, and you will answer happily to Peter Coates. I wonder if he's just answered to Lo Celso in Spain, because they don't do the there's no temptation whatsoever to do the Italian C there.
Well,
or it could be now as he's at Spurs, maybe he's going for a Jermaine Genus rebrand, just to mix it up a little bit.
Well, when I start making videos referring to myself as Coates, then you have every right to have a pop at me. As it is,
but I've lived this dilemma, because here in Rio I just become Chinvikri. And that's fine, I'll refer to myself like that, and so I wonder if something of that is happening with Gio. Let's just call him Gio.
Yeah, well, something.
Avoids
hopefully we'll get to the bottom of it at some point during this season. Surely someone's going to ask him. So I mean, Mr. WP asked how good can Giovani be, and I guess we've probably answered that. Potentially could be even better than Eriksen for Spurs, and certainly someone who will be earmarked as central to Argentina's plans going forward. But moving on, but still within Spurs, during the Copa America, Lo Celso kind of slightly slipped out of the starting 11 towards the end of the tournament, as we mentioned some of the problems with fitting him into the team. And it's Juan Foyth who actually emerged as a key player for Scaloni, becoming his first choice right back. Were it not for injury, during pre-season he may well have been taking up that role for Spurs. I mean, what do you make of Foyth at fullback?
Can't see it at all. No. I think it happens with Argentina for specific reasons. Firstly, they haven't got very good right backs, and secondly, the way that he ended up with that side. He was, I was in the stadium I was in the stadium for the Venezuela game. He's struggling so much to balance the thing out, because he's got Messi plus 2 centre forwards. So what he really wanted to do, remember towards the end of the competition, the games where Foyth was playing this, Venezuela and Brazil, who were up against fast wingers. He wanted a centre-back playing there, really. He wanted a defensive-minded player playing there. But, on the way that Tottenham play, throwing the fullbacks forwards, whether it's you got Walker Peters and Aurier there. Can you honestly see Foyth doing that? Can you honestly see a centre back bombing forward as an auxiliary winger down the right flank? Because I really, really can't see it. I can see in a back three. I can see that as a possibility. But the way that Pochettino in the majority of games uses his fullbacks, I just can't see Foyth fitting that mould.
No, I mean, for that reason, it's not really who I'd like to see long term for Argentina. I thought he did a passable job during the Copa America once he came in, as he said, against teams with decent wingers on the sort of brink of disaster at times, but managed to get away with it.
Good recovery. Recovers well. He's not that quick, I don't think, but he's got good recovery speed. So, there were times when he was really, really walking a tightrope, because he had to time that tackle, because he's let him get in the penalty area. He had to time that tackle to perfection to avoid giving away a penalty. And he's given away penalties in the Premier League, but his recovery speed just got him out of jail once or twice.
Yeah, and as you mentioned there, it seems to be more sort of lack of competition, which has been his real advantage for Argentina. I mean, Tom, full-back position for Argentina has been something that we've mentioned on numerous occasions. I mean, do you see any rival to that role for Argentina, or is Foyth going to be Scaloni's man going forward as we move towards the prospect of World Cup qualification next year?
I'm with Tim on this one. I mean, at the top level, you can't have him in the way that modern fullbacks play. He's great as a centre back who could step in there mid game if there's an injury or a red card, or if you're really under the cosh, or there's a few injuries, you could see him step in for a couple of games. But realistically, I don't think his long term future is there. I mean, it would have been he's an inexperienced defender, even in his sort of preferred position. So to put him out there on the right in a shambolic defensive line that's lacking in pace in general, I think he can be given a little bit of credit for how he did it at the Copa. But realistically, I mean, maybe you could argue that Argentina aren't a top level side, and therefore playing with more defensive fullbacks isn't as much of an issue. So realistically, I think they need to be looking at sort of more long-term issues that are not just short-term solutions. There's not any real candidates that stand out. Saravia kind of failed his audition at the Copa. Bustos hasn't been able to find his way back in, and there might be a few other players who make a run at the national team going forward. But realistically, I think the more we see him just playing in centre back, the better for the national team. So hopefully that experiment doesn't happen too much at Spurs and doesn't sort of tempt Scaloni into to try it a bit more. Another player that I'm interested to hear from Tim about in terms of Argentinians at Spurs is Lamela. He's someone who I've always really enjoyed watching ever since his time at River and how he managed to handle himself even in that disastrous relegation season. Injuries have kind of robbed him of maybe that half of a yard and certainly consistent run of first team football. But I'm always a bit surprised that he's not more in the picture for the Argentinian national team.
Yeah, perhaps. And I well remember being in Buenos Aires when Lamela was on the front cover of Olé, the Sports Daily, at the age of 13, and with the long lank hair that all the Argentines sported at that time, So there was always this huge fuss about him, and I wonder sometimes if he's a little bit frustrated that the reality of top class football hasn't always been as easy as maybe he was led to expect on the way up. I think one of the themes of Argentine football over recent years has been a wounded culture, wounded by player sales abroad. I think is far too quick to have people who do reasonably well in domestic football elevated to the level of phenomenons. And this has happened with so many. Any Argentine goalkeeper who manages to get in the way and make a save, is voted man of the match. And Lord knows, and the standard of the goalkeepers has been dreadful, and the technique of the goalkeepers I think has been poor for a while. And this applies to me as far as I'm concerned with Funes Mori. Who was hyped well beyond his capabilities. It applies to Pavon, who I think is now on the downside of a similar dynamic. And to a certain extent, maybe it happened to Lamela. The expectations that were created maybe too soon in his development have perhaps hampered him. I tend to see him, and I'd love to be wrong on this, but I tend to see him at the highest level as a nearly man. You know, and you mentioned that injuries may have robbed him just of that half a yard. He always looks to me, you know, when he unleashes one of those dribbles in the final third, he always looks to me as if he's not quite in control. I don't really trust it. Moments of quality, but I don't think enough to be a truly world-class player. I remember when he was at Roma, there was a Brazilian pundit who thought that in the future he would be in line to get on the podium in the World Player of the Year awards. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. I just don't think he's enough. I don't think he's quick enough. I don't think he's quite good enough to do that. For me, and I would love to be proved wrong, at the highest level, he's a nearly man.
Yeah, I mean, certainly suggestions so far of his Tottenham career would be in line with that. You do feel as though this is a key season for him. I'm not sure for how much longer Spurs would be happy to have him there as a nearly man. But it is a shame for Argentina because I feel as though after with Di Maria sort of going out of the picture on the left side of the attack, if you're going to play a 4-3-3 or even maybe a 4-2-3-1, Lamela is someone who should really be pushing for that position. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to just get the run of games and the consistency where you can make an argument for him to be in that team, even when there is a bit of a vacancy. So yeah, I'd sort of go along with that. Neil Fisher asks, sort of how are the Spurs players viewed in Argentina, and so does Kilibia's ponytail. How's Pochettino regarded? Yeah, I mean, Pochettino's regarded as an excellent manager, but as we already said, is very, very unlikely to be anywhere near the national team job for other reasons. And at the moment, I think all of their players would be viewed as going under the radar somewhat. They're yet to really break out. Lo Celso, we're waiting for him to make his mark on the national team. And as we mentioned, Lamela even coming through at River Plate, which probably aided his reputation, as you mentioned there, Tim, and probably helped him get hyped up, even though that River team were awful and got relegated. When you come through River's Academy, you tend to get a little bit more praise than you would at one of the lesser clubs. So, yeah, that's probably that. Guy Shelton said, is there a sort of affinity with Tottenham from Argentina because of Ardiles and Villa and Maradona playing at Aussie's testimonial, Kempes in a pre-season friendly? Tim, are you aware of that?
I remember being in the final of the Copa America in Buenos Aires in the Monumental 2011. And it was bitter. I don't know how you cope with it. It was so cold. And to protect myself against the cold, I had a Tottenham scarf on. And one of the young workers, one of the young volunteers at the tournament, he saw the Tottenham scarf and he went crazy about it. You know, he was aware of the affinity, so I ended up in a moment of benevolence that I've obviously long regretted. I ended up giving him the scarf. So his affinity has been aided by my generosity.
Oh, there you go. So Tim Vickery responsible for at least one extra Tottenham fan in Argentina. But I can't say I've noted in present day a huge influx of extra Argentina supporters from their current crop. Perhaps.
No, I think that Argentinian football fans, especially those who follow the game closely, are sort of well aware of the history, and obviously Ardiles and Villa were at the vanguard of foreign players coming over, and particularly at that time in the two countries' history together, it was it was quite a big move, and I think certainly my links to Cordoba and Ardiles there is a huge hero, and I think there's a lot of, certainly within the city there, there's a lot of goodwill, and everyone knows them without maybe having them on that same international level as the likes of Liverpool and Manchester United perhaps, but I think they are certainly one of maybe everyone's second favourite club or favourite English club, especially with Pochettino at the helm. I think there's a lot of people who are proud of the work that he's doing out there. So there's a lot of goodwill to Spurs, I think, generally in Argentina, if maybe not converting into tons of diehard fans just yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of it often, as it tends to in Argentina, depends on club loyalty. So Newell's supporters perhaps will be drawn to them because of Pochettino and so on. But Argentinians famously are fairly insular in their outlook on football. So it's like their club here and little more. But anyway, moving on from Spurs, if we go further north, Man City began their title defence with a thrashing of West Ham. Sergio Agüero scored his first of the season from the penalty spot. I guess we can assume we can assume that Agüero is going to score a hatful again this season, and was someone who was looked at as having a pretty positive Copa America. But where do you think he remains, or does he remain as Argentina's first choice striker going forward, Tim?
Well, I wonder for how long they'll be able to get away with playing Martinez, Agüero, and Messi. It was something that was improvised during the Copa. It really does load the team, top heavy, and I fear that Agüero will pay a price in this season for not having had a rest and for the work that he put in, the shift that he put in, because he was working back into the midfield, and they had to do that to balance out the side, and so I fear for him a little bit this season. I wonder if this will be the season where Gabriel Jesus comes through very, very, very strongly, and Agüero may start to be phased out a little bit in Man City terms. It's a long, grueling campaign with lots and lots of games. So going into this, I would be a little bit worried for Agüero, because and he worked like mad in the Copa America, and at the age that he is now, I think there's a price to pay for that.
Yeah, I mean, his contract obviously with City was extended to 2021, when there's still talk about a return to Independiente. Do you see that happening, Tom? I mean, how significant would that be?
Yeah, I can definitely see that happening in the future. He's talked about it for a long time. He's obviously, entwined with the club. His transfer to Atletico Madrid, I think, paid for a good part of their stadium. So he's someone who's still very involved, and I think he's always talked about wanting to go back while he's still got something to give, as we've seen with the likes of Tevez and Lisandro Lopez. There's that often feeling that I don't want to just go back to sort of have a little testimonial. I want to go back so I can actually win something with the club. So while he can still do a job at the highest level in Europe, I wouldn't be surprised if Man City was his last stop, and in a couple of years' time he did go back to Independiente. I definitely think that he's got a role to play in the national team, but I think at some point you've got to draw a line under his involvement as a starter, and sort of give the younger options like Lautaro, like Dybala, even, well, I don't know if Icardi is ever going to be realistically an option, but
we'll see whether he's playing cup football first.
Yeah, exactly. But I think while he's still obviously got a very good understanding with Messi, and he's shown under his years at under Guardiola at City that he can still develop, he can still adapt his game to sort of be at the highest level. I wouldn't want to see him necessarily booted out of the squad just yet, but maybe given more of a kind of substitute role, someone who's a wise head who can help bring through the new generation, while not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, because I think Gabriel Jesus had a good start to the season. It was a beautifully finished goal, kind of just with the sort of top of his instep, just flicking the ball in the near post. A really deceptively good finish, and I think he's due a good run in the first team, and it might be that slow phasing out of Agüero that we've kind of expected to come maybe sooner than this. So yeah, an interesting year ahead for Agüero for sure.
So I mean,
in terms of freshness, Gabriel Jesus won't be playing Brazil's friendlies next month or October. So, that gets him out of long journeys. And, in a style of football that puts the demands of intensity that City's does, I think that gives Gabriel Jesus a physical advantage over Agüero going into this season.
So do you think he could call it a day at City when his contract does finish in 2021?
I think there's every possibility, yeah. And he's talked, as Tom said, he's talked so much about this Independiente thing, and it would kind of be a shame if it didn't happen. You know, it's been talked up, it's been so expected. Looking back on his international career, because it's clearly now much closer to the end than the beginning. I think it's a great shame that and before Guardiola really got his hands on him, that he didn't really last the season. You know, he was clearly running on empty in a succession of major tournaments. That kind of 14, 15, 16 time. Yeah. He was on 14. He wasn't in the races in the World Cup. He really wasn't there at all. 15, I think he was much better. And 16. Higuain was the leading striker. I think Agüero was ludicrously mistreated in the World Cup last year. I think he's the only one who comes out, or almost the only one who comes out with credit, and he comes out with more credit than anyone else, And even then, he's in and out on the side, And I've never understood that. I've never understood the reluctance to really back him. Because if there was ever a time to back him, it was last year in the World Cup. Yeah. And he scores the cracker against Iceland, and then he's out the side, and it doesn't make any sense to me at all the way that Argentina have treated him. And clearly Scaloni didn't want to know about him. It was obvious that Scaloni wanted Icardi, and Agüero got back in because Messi told him. Either do that or maybe I ain't turning up. So even though I think he's Argentina's third all-time top scorer, Agüero. Yeah. It could have been better had he been fitter during the tournaments, and it could have been better had he been better handled, I think, by Argentina coaches who seem he's always the first choice to be substituted, and I've never understood it.
Yeah, I don't have the stat handy, but the number of times he's only played 90 minutes is a handful of times he's played the full game. It's astonishing with the amount of caps he's got, but that certainly backs up what you're saying. So, I mean, if the idea is that playing two up front isn't a long-term strategy, do you go with Lautaro now as the main number one?
Yeah, well, there is and we saw this very clearly with Brazil this year in the Copa America. How hosting a tournament, or in Argentina's case, hosting a tournament, the Copa next year, that can alter your priorities, because Brazil divided the 4-year period from 2018 to 2022 into two. Got to win the Copa America, do that, then we build towards the next World Cup. Argentina, this process is a little bit interrupted. Really, they kind of wasted a year with a caretaker coach, and they had to find a model of play under pressure during the Copa America, and so now, are they building to the World Cup, or are they building towards the Copa America? Mm-hmm. Is there a short-term imperative to do well on home ground in the Copa America? If so, that delays the likes of Agüero leaving the scene. If not, if you're looking at 2022, then maybe Lautaro is your man.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like for the short term, perhaps Agüero's going to keep his place, but Lautaro certainly did his chances no harm in Brazil. Sticking with the City game, in a 5-0 win, we didn't get to see a great deal from West Ham. Manuel Lanzini was back fit again. Tom, do you think Lanzini could be someone that breaks into Scaloni's plans?
Well, yeah, he was so close to sort of breaking into the World Cup squad and being a big part already, but then injury robbed him of that chance. He was riding the crest of the wave. I mean, I saw him at the Etihad for Argentina versus Italy, and he was one of the better performers, and he really looked like he was going to maybe take one of those sort of wide attacking midfield roles and kick on. Certainly, as we've mentioned already, the fact that they're still relying on the headless chicken Di Maria and or Marcus Acuna in his kind of limited role, sort of gave the opportunity for someone like Lanzini or Pity Martinez as another option. So it was a real cruel blow for him, and I think this year is going to be big for him again. West Ham have, they brought in a lot of players last year. Pellegrini did quite a good job of sort of gelling that all together and getting them playing some all right stuff at times. So now there's a bit more stability there. They've obviously bolstered their squad with some big names, and the fact that Lanzini's coming back into it, you'd hope that he's going to once again be a talisman for them. And if he can refine that form that he was showing before his injury, then I think he's one of those players that's certainly going to be knocking on the door for a place in the Copa America squad.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot in the years sort of around the 2014 World Cup and just after how Argentina lacked midfielders that could sort of add a bit of dynamism there, in terms of it was sort of a court between a lot of number 5s and then some number 10s. And Lanzini developed when he left River as a youngster into something somewhere in between, I think, and he could have done something. Has been a bit unfortunate with injuries. Timmy, do you look at Lanzini and for another matter, as we talk Premier League, Roberto Pereira at Watford as options in that midfield?
I wonder if Pereira's time might have passed now. Certainly, when I was back in England recently, talking to Watford fans, they were telling me that since a recent injury, he hasn't been the same player. And if you take some of the battery out of him, there isn't a great deal left to tip the balance at the highest level. So I would wonder about him. Lanzini clearly has a future, and I would endorse what has been said. I think that this is almost make or break for him, isn't it, in terms of his international ambitions this season?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right about Pereira as well. He's always going to be on the fringe. He's not someone who's ever going to tip the balance at the highest level, and he's kind of just purely by the fact that he's playing for that middle class of Premier League kind of club. He's not necessarily going to get the headlines, but he's always going to be a consideration of, okay, well, we need a couple of extra players, maybe just to make up the numbers, and we know he can do a solid job without really ever becoming something special for the national team. I think Lanzini, as we've said, is maybe got more to give than that, but it's neither one, I think, are going to be sort of huge players in the mid to long term, and realistically they've both got to show big seasons this year if they want to crack into that Copa America squad, which might be one of their few opportunities to really make a name for themselves or for the national team.
Looking slightly more long term, perhaps Man City's big rivals for the title, Liverpool, obviously made fairly light work of Norwich ultimately. But there was somebody worth mentioning when we talk about Argentina's long term. Adam Brandon sent in a question saying, we all know the best Argentine in the Premier League plays for City, Norwich City. Do you think Emi Buendía has got a chance of making the Argentina squad by or for the Copa America next year?
I think his chances were boosted considerably last year by Marcelo Bielsa. Because Buendía played most of his football abroad, and I remember him playing for Argentina at under-20 level. I think there was a tug of war with Spain at under 20 level, and he was it was as a lot of them have been, and until this year that was a bit better. It was a very poor Argentina under 20 side that he played in. So you weren't going to make your name playing in that one. And then he was really out of sight, out of mind, wasn't he? And the fact that Bielsa went to the Championship last year, really, I think it did wonders for the Championship in general. Just to see so many South American journalists discussing Championship sides, it was almost surreal. So the Bielsa effect helped put some spotlights on Buendía, but it's all to be done this season. You ain't going to get in the Argentina squad on what you do for Norwich City in a Championship if they can hold their own in the Premier League, then maybe. But I think that there's a bit of a queue. Yeah,
I think that's the big issue with Emi Buendia's chances of the national team is just so many players ahead of him in the kind of position he plays, sort of diminutive winger slash playmaker role. Here in Norwich myself, I've actually had the pleasure of meeting him in Cafe Nero of all places, and he's a very nice and humble guy, and we chatted for a little while there, and he's someone who's had to work hard. He's didn't really make the grade at Getafe, dropped down on to the Spanish second division with Cultural Leonesa, and then sort of made his name there. And it was a bold move for Norwich when they were in the Championship to sort of pluck a fairly untested young Argentinian out and spend a decent amount of money for a time when they didn't have a lot. A lot's been made about Stuart Webber's role at the club there, and everyone at the club does sing his praises about the impact he's had on and off the field in terms of the recruitment he's brought in and just the general atmosphere around the club. He really tore up the Championship last season, and he's going to be one of the players that Norwich look to. Realistically, as we've said, he's a long way off. He's not even in the conversation really in Argentina. If he has a sensational year, then perhaps you could hear some rumours. But I think realistically, without any disrespect to Norwich, he would probably have to go to a bigger club before certainly people back in Argentina would take his claims a bit more seriously.
Did he have his loyalty card stamped?
I don't know.
Is he after a free coffee?
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely tucking into a cappuccino with his wife and son and an agent there. I think his agent was the one who was handling all the coffee related negotiations. But that's where you can find him, guys.
And if he keeps Norwich up, I'm sure he'll be in for free coffee for the rest of his time in England. Tim, you mentioned we'll get onto him now. As you mentioned, Senor Bielsa. Obviously, it was a bit of a mad appointment, but what have you made of his time in Leeds, and do you see them making that return this year round to the Premier League?
I haven't seen a great deal of it. I've got a continent to watch, and time is limited to watch the second tier of English football. So I've watched it from afar, really, but I've loved it. I've loved the whole thing. My question would be, and it is a question rather than a statement, because as I said, I haven't watched enough. But they did tail off before the end of the season, and my fear at the start of this time last year, my fear was that they would tail off towards the end of the season. It's it's what you're expecting from a Bielsa team. Given the physical intensity that he demands, it's a long season. So I would wonder if they've tailed off for the reasons that Bielsa sides have tailed off in the past, that physically they didn't have enough gas in the tank to get them over the line. And if so, why would that not be a problem again this year? Have steps been taken, a deeper squad, for example, or any other steps taken to avoid that pitfall, if that was the pitfall that they fell down last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the defenders of Bielsa would have said that it seemed to be their finishing which let them down, in terms of the still being on top in key games in the run-in and just missing a lot of chances, which ended up costing them.
That can clearly be put down to a tiredness thing. It's not getting your body into the right shape to finish is something that is more likely to happen when you're drained.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly going to be interesting to see if it happens again. Then they will be even more weight towards that argument. You do question if it was to come up short again, would that be the end we see of Bielsa in England?
Well, I hope not, because people have thoroughly enjoyed it. On the whole Spygate thing was absolutely brilliant, wasn't it? Because I've been droning on about this fella ever since I discovered him in the late 90s, and he is so spectacular. because it honestly it isn't forced, is it? He hasn't created a personality that he's then a prisoner of. He is this figure. That's what he is, and that's what makes it so absolutely fascinating. You know, I mean, I'm so delighted that this little secret that we had over here, we can now share with people back in England, because he is someone whose presence enriches the game. He brings so much to football, and it's wonderful the way that the Leeds fans have responded to him, even though the season didn't end in promotion. They still seem really, really keen on this project. He's enthused people, and one of those, one of those. It's one of those civic pride stories, and that's part of what football is all about, I think. So I wish him every success.
That's exactly it, really. He's, even if he doesn't take Leeds back to the promised land, he's really made the club, care again. The feel good factor was back, and he's really connected with the fans, which I think at the end of the day, is always going to leave that lasting impression. Yes, they definitely tired last season, and they've managed to keep hold of some important players. Certainly Calvin Phillips, the young defensive midfielder, is excellent. The fact they've got Jack Clark back on loan after he moved to Spurs is going to be big, because he certainly absolutely destroyed Aston Villa when he came off the bench last season, and he looks a really exciting talent. And then they've got some decent loan players like Helder Costa, who's done very well for Wolves at that level. Eddie Nketiah from Arsenal is a highly rated young talent. So I think they're going to be among the favourites, but you do worry how much of the whirlwind of last season is going to affect them, and the fact they got so close and then missed out on automatics, and then sort of just mentally were absolutely drained by the time it got to the playoffs. So in many ways you can look at lots of different clubs and see how they bounce back from that kind of adversity. We saw it with Liverpool, missing out on the Champions League and a potential league title and getting the Champions League. Hopefully we'll see Spurs do something similar in terms of how close they got, and if they can get some kind of silverware or just keep up pace with Liverpool and Man City, and it's going to be really interesting to see if Leeds can do something similar. It's a very, very underrated skill to have that kind of mental fortitude, and I think maybe the players, now that they've had a year of Bielsa ball, they know what to expect a little bit more, and that experience for they'll be hoping will hopefully stand them in good stead.
Yeah, I mean, Tim mentioned the Spygate scandal, obviously. In the opposite dugout at the time, Frank Lampard, he ended up at Chelsea. Tom, do you feel like Chelsea could have been bold and gone for Bielsa instead?
Yeah, I mean, if it would have been very interesting, because I think if someone who's very stuck in their ways like Sarri didn't really fit in there, then sort of Bielsa would have been just ramping up to the next level. So I'm not sure he would have necessarily been the right fit for a club like Chelsea. But I think it's always interesting to follow Bielsa's movements and his impact on the game all over the world, but particularly if you look at some of the top level managers in the Premier League who have been influenced by him, is having that trickle down effect, and his presence in the Championship, is also making a lot of young managers and sort of clubs that maybe you wouldn't think of as progressive in the past. Sort of, I think he's part of a wider trend, and certainly one of the reasons for that trend of a lot more kind of progressive football coming through the lower divisions, and I think he's been a huge part of that in sort of English football of late.
Yeah.
And I might have told you this one before, so apologies if I have, but we're going back now 4 years to when I was in the stadium watching the World Cup qualifier, Brazil-Argentina in Belo Horizonte. And I got chatting away to the former Argentine captain, Juan Pablo Sorin. And this was at a time when the England team were in a bit of a mess. It was pre-Gareth Southgate. and so on. And Sorin asked me, what was happening with England and so on. And I said, I've got the solution. I think England should appoint Marcelo Bielsa. And he just looked at me and he said, that's a brilliant, brilliant idea. And then he thought a little bit more and he said, no, it can't happen. And I said, why not? Because he said, and then I would feel obliged to support England, and I don't want to do that. So, but I hadn't thought about that idea of maybe a club of like Chelsea going with him. I mean, it would be an excellent choice if Chelsea wanted to change their image. Maybe they tried that a little bit with Sarri last season, and then they didn't have the patience. But it would be fascinating to see what happens after Leeds. If someone else in England, if a bigger club there, with all due respect to Leeds, might want to have a look and take him on. And the Spygate thing, he just used it to give a lesson, didn't he? And you do worry about his sanity sometimes. The amount of games that he watches, you think, please go and do something else, ease off. But I'm always delighted when he's in the frame, because he's such a positive force within football. He's someone who, he demands that his players be professional, but also retain that amateur love for the game, which he clearly has. He is a professional, and the contract negotiations with him have never been easy. But he is a professional who also he enthuses that amateur love for the game that he has. I think is infectious, and that's one of the reasons I think that the Leeds fans have been so inspired by what he's done, even though last season didn't end up being totally successful.
Yeah. So whatever happens with Leeds, the more we get to see of Bielsa, the better. So hopefully he will be sticking around. Well, I mean, wherever he ends up, I'm sure that'll end up meaning we'll start watching there. But certainly has been fascinating seeing him in England. Couple of questions that just came in to tie things up. Jimmy, who runs the Belgrano in English account, said, although he's not Argentinian, he did play in Argentina. What do we expect to see from Miguel Almirón this season? How many games without scoring before the fans start to turn on him? Tom, what do you reckon about Almirón at Newcastle?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's had that bedding in period now. So while the honeymoon period might be over, he's certainly going to be the key creative force for Newcastle. He's got that electric pace in full flight. He's an absolute joy to watch, and we saw sort of glimpses of it for Paraguay in the Copa America. And I think otherwise, with everything else that's going on around the club, the protests and calls to boycott the stadium, I think he's one of the few shining lights. I don't know how Steve Bruce is really going to get the best out of him as someone who's had to watch a fair amount of his football over the last couple of years. But he's certainly someone who needs to sort of grab the ball by the horns and really take responsibility for the creative burden. Money has been spent on Joe Ellington, who I'll be interested to hear what Tim thinks of there. And then there's a couple of other flair players who've been brought in, but I think Almiron's the one who's really going to make or break whether Newcastle can beat the odds and avoid the drop. So I'm really hoping he does well, because he was absolutely sensational for Lanús. So I've got fingers crossed that he at least provides some light at the end of the tunnel for those Newcastle fans. I
think his big regret is he's not going to be playing against the Argentina defence every week. Because that goal that he set up in the Copa America, and he was quicker running with the ball than the Argentina defenders were running without it. But I'm a huge fan. All right, and maybe that question seemed to allude to the fact that his decision making in front of goal and last 30 could still be improved, and that's correct. But I believe in him a lot. I think he's got terrific pace, and there's some quality there in that left foot. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the partnership between him and Joe Ellington, because I didn't see a great deal of Joe Ellington. I mean, he didn't play very much here, but what I saw just had my eyes popping out. And Hoffenheim, they usually get things right. They pick up these Brazilians who fly under the radar. They develop them and they sell them off at a huge profit, and they pick up these technically gifted players. And Joelinton is a centre forward with centre forward's attributes, who is also technically proficient. And I would hope that him and Almirón will be able to get on the same wavelength, because if so, then Newcastle should have a comfortable year.
Yeah, I mean, obviously started off with a 1-0 defeat to Arsenal on Sunday. Joelinton showed flashes, I think, of some of that quality that you mentioned there, Tim. There was a couple. He didn't have a lot to go on, certainly as the game went on, but there was a couple of chances and a couple of moments where you just saw that shining through. And I think Almirón had another frustrating afternoon, but certainly for those of us who have seen plenty of Almirón from his time here and for and for Paraguay, there is reason to be optimistic for Newcastle. I think they haven't yet seen that side of Almirón. They've seen, again, just flashes of it, seen that pace that you mentioned, Tom, but there is more to him than that. And provided Steve Bruce can provide the platform, I guess they're going to be playing a lot on the counter. Yeah. I mean, Almirón's perfect for doing that. I mean, he works hard, tracks back, but with that pace, as you mentioned as well, Tim, on the ball, he's absolutely lethal on the counter-attack if he can burst out.
Yeah, and maybe the problem there is going to be getting the first goal. But if Newcastle can get ahead, then Almirón is the type of player who can really shine there. You know, when there's space to burst into. But so getting that first goal, getting Newcastle ahead, that's the big challenge, and that's the thing that they've brought Joelinton for. They probably paid a little bit over the odds for him, but you know, centre forwards are gold dust. So if he can do that, and then Newcastle can protect a lead, and Almirón is exactly the type of player to hit the opposition on the break.
Yeah. And finally then, Jamie sent in a question. He said, I had good fun the other day with a friend of mine naming Argentine players who have played in the Premier League but are not very well known in Argentina at all. For example, Mauricio Pochettino and Julian Speroni. Can you think of any more?
Well, I mean, I think there's always a good vein of goalkeepers who've never really played too much in Argentina, but then have gone on to have decent careers. Willy Caballero would be one who, you know, he got a few games with Boca, and I think he had a loan at Arsenal Sarandí. But realistically, most of his career has been in Spain and in the UK. So he would be one. I don't know how much Alejandro Faulin would be in that category, really. I mean, obviously an absolute legend at QPR, and someone who didn't really play too much in his early career in Argentina at all. Sort of Rosario Central and River Plate kind of in the early days, but moved. I think he had a little spell with Rafaela as well, and perhaps Instituto they'd be one of the teams that would say that, yeah, okay. He had a good spell with us as well, but I think in his main career he sort of spent in England and might be more fondly remembered over here than over there. Maybe a similar situation with Julio Arca as well. Yeah. I mean, these are the names I'm thinking of, but it's quite hard to know because if there's not too many that move. Certainly in the past who've moved at a young age and then sort of gone straight into the Premier League. It's maybe something that's happening a bit more now with Argentinian players getting snapped up at an ever earlier age.
Yeah, Julio Arca was certainly one that jumped out when I was thinking. He played a bit for Argentinos Juniors, but had most of his career basically in the northeast of England. And I think last time I heard was still playing for South Shields or someone in the sort of lower leagues. Anyone that springs to mind for you, Tim?
But at least Arca was known because he played for Argentina in a successful under-20 side.
Yeah.
The ones like the one that who leapt to mind as you were reading out the question was Speroni. You know, who didn't come through that route at all. I think Faulin played under 17 for Argentina, but there are ones like Speroni who the Argentine public only discover when they're abroad. Maybe Gazzaniga is in the same kind of category.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Murphy contingent sticking together at Spurs there.
Yeah, and of course, Tottenham's rivals Arsenal also have a young Argentine reserve goalkeeper as well in Emiliano Martinez.
Is he still there?
Yeah, I think he was at Reading last season. I think
he's going to retire there, isn't he? And he played under 17 for Argentina.
Yeah,
and I was always surprised that Arsenal bought him because he couldn't jump, he just couldn't get off the ground. So physically, I think they had to do a lot of work on him. I had no idea he was still there. I'd forgotten all about him.
Well, yeah, I think he was on the bench at the weekend. But yeah, and I think another one who's just sort of crept into my mind would be Leonardo Ochoa as well. Because even though he had a brief spell,
played a little bit,
a little bit, but
minor
again,
clubs. Yeah,
I mean, sat a little spell at San Lorenzo, but nothing to really write home about. It was more, was it CAI over in down in the south in Chubut. So yeah, he's another one who's got it. But again, like I mentioned earlier, the love for football in Argentina means that you've got so many people who are fanatical about it and know all the players' histories, and they'll know who their clubs came from. I mean, even someone like I've completely forgotten who I was going to say now. Scrap that.
Well, there we go. There's a few. Anyway, probably should have asked that question a little bit, given us a bit more advanced warning, because I fired out a tweet about 20 minutes or so before calling you both to record. So I had no time to actually try and do a bit of research and sound better informed or more intelligent than I am. But that, I think, is everything for today. So as ever, huge thanks to Tom Robinson. That's at TomRobbo89 on Twitter.
Cheers, thanks Peter, always a pleasure. And looking forward to the next one.
And a huge thanks to Tim Vickery. I'll probably be seeing you next week, Tim, in Buenos Aires.
Indeed, yeah. Paths will cross.
And if you want to hear more from Tim, obviously you've got the BBC World Football phone-in, and you can find him on Twitter at Tim Vickery or at Tim_Vickery. They're both there and talking plenty of South American football most of the time, or Spurs or Villa. But thanks as ever for listening, and once again, if you do want to like and share and all that stuff, please do so we know to do some more. Thanks again.